Hello, our topic is archetypes in astrology. Clear and simple. We hear the term archetype over and over and over and over again in astrology, and sometimes people say, well, what exactly do you mean by archetype? And it usually becomes difficult to articulate exactly what we mean. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to present a view into archetypes that's really practical, down to earth, and simple. And from that, talk about what the relationship of archetypes to astrology is, and some of the good things that come out of our use of the word archetypes and the concept of archetypes in astrology, some things that are not so good. So I've got here, that phrase, the good, bad, and ugly. So first of all, when we talk about archetypes in relationship to astrology, let me present it like I said, in this very, very simple way. There's many ways into this, and this is just one way of thinking about it. Let's take the behavior of humans. What do we people do on planet Earth? Well, we do a lot of things. One of the things we do is we have athletic events, football games, American football, or what we call in America soccer, which is more popular in most of the world. We have Olympic Games, which are a big deal. The whole world organizes around these. We have other kinds of contests, like chess games, maybe not as common now as in some historical periods in some countries, duels, and also things like military battles, which are also a kind of contest. So these contests are done for different reasons, different motivations, but they have something in common, this idea of coming face to face in some kind of set of rules, like the athletic game. Even military activities obey certain sets of rules. Certain things are considered to be out of bounds. So these contests happen. Now, what is going on? Why do people engage in these contests? And if you think about it, the amount of time, energy, money, these huge stadiums, 100,000 people packed in to watch, here in the United States, the baseball games, the hockey games. I mean, wow, it's just unbelievable. And like I said, all the other kinds of contests. So what's going on here? Is it just that people like to develop skills, become ambitious, or what's going on? Well, one way to think of it is this. Is it that the contest is just an accumulation of little things, being built from components like personal ambition, striving for success, and all of these components build up to a net result of contest? Or could it be the other way around? That the contest itself has like a primary reality, that it's primary, that the contest, the story of the contest is actually a kind of given. Now, I know this sounds strange, but bear with me a minute, because this gets to the heart of what Carl Jung meant by archetypes. Is that often we think of evolution in this Darwinian sense, that you have these little organisms, single cell organisms, and they combine together and make more complex organisms, and it evolves and gets more complicated, and you end up with human beings and other complex life forms. So we have this idea that complex things are built from basic, fundamental, simple things. We have that idea in chemistry. They have these basic elements. We have that idea in music. It's composed of individual single notes. But the idea of archetypes is that maybe not all of life is complex forms built from simple forms. Maybe the complex form has a kind of ontological primary function, ontological meaning being, so that the contest itself is a kind of fundamental thing that has been passed down for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's an ancestral memory, the contest. And we become players in the contest. So the contest is so ancient, is so fundamental. We don't know exactly how old it is. And Carl Jung didn't talk about that a lot. And in a way, it doesn't matter whether people have been engaged in contests for 10,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000 years. It's so ancient, it feels almost like it's eternal. And the contest itself is a thing. It's a mental thing. It's a construct in our psyche. And another part of this idea of archetype is that a lot of our minds, if not all of our thoughts, are shared. So again, we have this idea in just common thinking that big things are just a lot of little things put together. So our individual brain cells are all, firing, these messages between each other and crossing the synapses, and then out of that thought is born. But instead of thought being born out of your cells, what if our brains are more like radio receivers, and they're receiving information, and that information and intelligence is actually shared? It's like, imagine a cloud, like this big cloud, and that cloud contains all this information and ideas, and we receive information from it. It's like a field. Just to, give it a visualization. Maybe it doesn't exist in space, but the main point is this, that there are thoughts that we receive, and we become examples of that. And these thoughts are not all little tiny things. There are entire stories all put together. And here we understand the power of mythology, because mythology of any kind, and even just old stories, even religious stories, these stories that are handed down, and they take many variations, different costumes, different environments, but there's something the same, consistent, that runs through every country, every period of history. We are more the same than we think we are. When I say we, people around the world and people throughout history, we're actually like actors on a stage. What's really happening is that the story is fundamental and we're acting it out. So this is the idea of archetypes. And it's not some abstract, far-fetched idea or something that only people that are spiritually oriented are engaged in. Carl Jung's idea of archetypes is that it explains our behavior. So much of what we do is an unconscious enactment of a myth, of the hero, of the great mother, of the mad scientist, of the gypsy, the wandering minstrel. These images take on different forms, they take on different costumes, but they're repeated over and over and over again. So that's the idea of what an archetype is. Very, very, very simple. It's just that the myth is not some arbitrary story that people happen to just think of. It exists in the psyche. And the psyche is this collective. It's like a memory bank that we all access. It's like we're all computers accessing the memory bank. Well, we're more than, mechanical computers, but just that aspect of it, this shared psyche. So that's what archetypes are. You begin to realize that we fall into roles, classic roles in our lives, and we act them out. And here's one more point about the archetype. The archetype has enormous power. It has a collective power. So when you embrace the role of the protector, the person who protects, the father who protects the family, the police person who protects the community, a good, if we imagine this myth in its good side, the positive power of protecting, a form of caring that involves protection. So, and another thing about the myths is you cannot put them in boxes and just list them. One myth runs into another one, runs into another. So they're not completely separate, quantifiable stories, but they still exist, even though there's a little bit of fluidity, and they can even change. They're not eternally, never-ending, perfect elements, like we could imagine the elements in chemistry are, essentially unchanging relative, at least to our lives. So, but they're still fundamental. They're still ancient, and they have tremendous power. So you do not want to transcend, evade, ignore myth. You want to immerse yourself in it. By immersing yourself in the myth, your life has meaning. Jung says without myth, our lives are meaningless. We're bored. So this is not something to transcend. It's not something that's silly, like, oh my God, I'm just acting out the contest, that's been, how boring is that? No, the contest is life. It is the meaning, purpose, the narrative of what it is to be a human being in its highest potential. So we want to embrace these myths. We want to be part of something bigger than ourselves, of something universal, in the best possible way. When we engage in the myth for selfish reasons, for destructive reasons, for unconscious reasons, that myth can act out in extremely destructive and negative ways. But it's going to act out one way or another. And if you do not engage in myth, you just think it's silly, your life becomes meaningless, bored. Jung says in his classic popular book, Man and His Symbols, that, without myth, you become bored. And boredom is the worst. People would rather kill than be bored. Anything but boredom. So you will not be bored when you express the power of myth, of archetype. So what is an archetype? An archetype is a story. It's a narrative that is ancient, that is primal, that is universal, and that gives meaning and power to our lives. And whether we want to or not, whatever philosophy we have, we live out these myths. So the story is more primary. Not all of life is built from tiny elements. There are these things that are whole and complete stories that are also fundamental. So that's the idea that's different from some of the common sense, you might say more materialistic way of thinking, that everything that's conscious, that's complex, is built out of little tiny elements and is individual, and then the individual things are put together. Carl Jung has reversed it. He says there are things that are put together and that are shared, that are primary. They're not necessarily the most ancient or most fundamental, but they are fundamental and primary in our lives. Okay, so let me read this just to repeat these points. What if intelligence is not built from tiny components that are pieced together to make stories, but rather the stories exist first, and the pieces of the story fill in variations of the theme? That's exactly the idea of an archetype. The stories exist, and we fill in the variations of the theme. What if life did not ultimately evolve from primitive organisms, but rather primitive organisms are a manifestation of a greater intelligence? This is also part of the idea of archetypes. Now, both can be happening. You can believe in archetypes and you can believe in evolution from basic elements. It can be traveling in both directions. from the simple to the complex and from the complex to the simple. So actually believing in archetypes, seeing their power, observing them, does not mean you're anti-evolution. It just means you're seeing that pathway as well. So you can embrace both pathways, both the pathway from the simple to the complex and from the complex to the simple. From complex to simple means that the story, the narrative, the characters in that narrative, that's the archetypal story, the myth with its characters, is fundamental and primary as well. So, this idea of archetypes, again, does not mean it's the only thing and that the archetypes are the source of everything and everything that's simple evolves from things that are more complicated. No, but at a minimum, to read from the last paragraph here, deep ancestral memories of stories are at the heart of what is most important and meaningful to us. And these deep, mythic ancestral stories are enormously powerful, motivating forces. That's the idea. And again, we don't have to say one is more primal or, how everything is. All we are saying in this idea of Jungian archetypes is that these ancient ancestral memories of stories are very powerful, very meaningful, and we should embrace them and express the highest potential of them. That's the healthy thing to do. So I mentioned this before. Jung said that without archetypes, we are bored and we would rather kill than be bored. Now, stereotypes fulfill our need for mythic stories in a very limited way that's not conducive to the health and evolution of people, but just, it's one expression of archetypes or stereotypes. So people will stereotype different nationalities, different groups. So they'll say, oh, Germans, they're the engineers. And Americans, oh, they're the free and the brave. And the Latin Americans, they're very amorous and emotional, and they're good dancers. And males are the fighters and the thinkers, while women are the nourishers, and they give life. And these are all archetypal images. And it's why these limited ideas are hard to change. Why do people hold on to ideas that are simply wrong? Look at all the limitations of half of the human species, women, through almost every culture. How can people persist in putting people in boxes and limiting what they can do just based on a classification? Why? Well, of course, it preserves the power of one part. There's a lot of reasons. But another reason is it fulfills the archetypal story, that you now have people to fulfill those images of the great mother. Who's going to be the great mother better than women? Who's going to be the warrior? The men can play that role. So we find people to live out this imagery, these stories. And we will do it even if those characters are not consistently good at it. So the power of myth is one of the things that keeps people locked into a very limited and fictitious, delusional perception of the world, because we will project these myths, we will make these myths, we will live these myths at all cost. They're so important. And we will force things to match our myth, our story. So if we believe America's the free and the brave, then I have this in the bottom paragraph here. This read from the second sentence. The USA is the land of the brave and free. Okay, that's an archetypal story. And the United States does express that archetypal story. It is true to some extent. We all collectively and individually embrace different mythic stories. It doesn't mean some other country cannot express it or express it better, but it is one of the myths and images, the eagle, the 13 colonies. It is one of the visions of America, the free, the proud, the brave. And some people will believe in this myth, heart and soul, without any fine nuances. Even though the United States was built on slavery, it was built on the subjugation of human rights and human dignity, to some extent. Now what happens? People become very emotional about these archetypes. And they will say, oh, he's for critical race theory. He's saying everybody in the United States is a racist. We will get so emotional, so passionate, so argumentative. Because when you touch on people's myths, on the archetype, you've hit a sensitive buzzer. That's the thing that we live for. We live for this myth. And it can become difficult to talk about it rationally. What are the good parts about how the United States embraces the myth? What has the United States done well with the myth of the hero, of the brave, of the proud, of the free? And what has it not done so well? And what is it doing now? And what can it do better? It's something for a rational, intelligent conversation, if we can have that. And with any country. Yes, the Germans have been great engineers. Yes, Latin Americans have introduced wonderful dance. You know, the different dances that we have taken here, where I live in America, from South America. And the different rhythms. Yes, those are contributions. Those are areas that people have specialized in. But when we become unconsciously immersed in the myth and force everything to fit the myth and not observe what's actually happening and what the people are actually capable of, then that myth limits life rather than enhance it. Anyway, the point is, archetypes are running our lives. Jung is correct. I think he's correct, is running our lives. And it explains a lot of things. In the second paragraph here on this slide, at American universities, even students majoring in the sciences will dive deep into the intense drama and spectacle of the football game. We become irrationally crazy, involved in the contest, and so excited about it. And that contest, that sporting event, for some people is so silly, so ridiculous. But life is supposed to be silly and ridiculous. We're supposed to be engaged in these myths. That gives vibrancy, that gives soul, that gives depth, that gives meaning to our lives. The meaning of the contest is not in analyzing it in terms of its components. It's the contest. This is a great ritual that's being lived out. We just want to do it in a beautiful way, in a conscious way, in a way that brings out the best potential and not all of the problems that are possible. So, people return from war emotionally scarred for the rest of their lives, and they can return from war and not receive proper treatment for the scars, physical and emotional, that they've received, and yet they are hailed as the greatest heroes and praised with nothing short of reverence. So again, the story of the hero and the sacrifice, and how we live out our dreams and don't always pay attention to the details. Okay, this story is going on. What do we do about it? How do we handle it? What are the details? So Jung's theory of archetypes has tremendous explanatory power. It explains why we behave the way we do. It's a great theory, but it is difficult to assess the validity of the theory of archetypes in any way than in our recognition of it in our lives. Jung's theory of archetypes is a difficult theory to test, to scientifically evaluate. And for that reason, it's fallen out of favor in a lot of the universities. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just difficult to test. Some things are easier to test than others. I think that Jung's theory of archetypes is brilliant. I think it's true. It helps us understand things. Happens to be difficult to test empirically, but it is nevertheless a very helpful concept that it helps understand how humans operate. And last sentence on the slide, a fulfilling life is a successful and productive embodiment of myth. Okay, now, what does all this have to do with astrology? So, astrology is a fascinating intersection of mythology and a mythology that's not just projected on the stars. But astrologers believe that these myths, these stories, the Mars is the warrior, and Venus can be the princess, and so on, and Saturn, the wise old man, and all these different stories and myths are written in the sky according to astrologers. So astrology is a fascinating idea that myth is not only just in our minds, but is somehow anchored to the physical world. That's a wild idea, a very intriguing idea, that somehow the physical world, specifically the positions of the planets or maybe the stars, things in the cosmos, are actually somehow synchronized with the mythology, with these essential stories. That's what we're proposing as astrologers. And to non-astrologers, who, typically people who are very educated, it can just sound like magical thinking. Like, oh my God, these astrologers never grew up emotionally. They're like stunted in their emotional growth. It's magical thinking. They're not rational. They're not scientific. They're not reasonable. This idea that these myths are actually in the sky. Of course, I'm an astrologer, and I think they are. So, but I think they're in the sky in a different way than modern Western psychological astrologers would say, but indirectly they are related. I mean, I think the stars relate to our lives. So, that basic principle is something that every astrologer agrees with. So astrologers who perceive astrology at its most essential and fundamental nature as being an archetypal language. So some astrologers view astrology as an archetypal language. I do not. I believe my theoretical framework for astrology is that astrology works by vibration. It works by functions, fundamental functions in the universe that are operating by vibration and by structures in space. And the archetypes are born out of those vibrations and those purposes in our psyche. So I see archetypes as something that humans have, and the interaction of these basic functions develop the archetypal stories in our minds. I do not think that Venus is literally a princess or Mars is literally a warrior. I believe that Venus is attraction to beauty. It's a force, it's a function, it's a motivation. And things combine in different vibrations to give different effects. So we can visualize it differently, but somehow the myth is an important part of our lives. Now, there's one more point I want to make, because this is like where everything is leading up to in terms of archetypes and mythology and astrology. This is the extremely important point I want to make. It's because archetypes are so important, because they're so powerful, because they're so motivating, because they're so meaningful, and because astrology is constantly referring to archetypes, it becomes difficult for us to always be rational and careful in our thinking. So, for example, when we hear that Chiron is the wounded healer, and there's even a Greek myth that tells the story of the wounded healer, and we have a wound in our lives, and we've worked to heal that wound, and we feel that our woundedness is more conspicuous than other people. And then if we see that Chiron in our birth charts is conspicuous in some way, makes more aspects, we feel validated. We feel like the cosmos is on our side. We feel that a missing link in astrology has been filled in. And we feel that greater meaning is now in the astrology chart and in our lives. We feel that we have found our place in the cosmos. So what I'm saying is this, is that the mythology is so powerful that if you ever encounter an idea in astrology and that mythic story associated with it resonates for you, it makes sense, it's very difficult to let go of it. Very difficult to let go of it. In the same way that any mythic story is difficult to let go of. In the same way that people have limited the capacity of so many human beings by forcing them into some myth that those people must live out this part, this character in the myth. They're not allowed to step outside that. Even though those characters are not appropriate for that myth, they're still forced into it. And I think we do the same thing in astrology. We get a hold of an idea, it works a few times, and we insist and we hold on to it very passionately that this is what the planet means. These myths are so powerful. Consider that even Jesus and Buddha are primarily mythic. This is one of the things that Carl Jung said, and I think he's right. Now, did Jesus actually live? Yes, I'm sure he did. Are many of the stories of him true? They may be. The fact that it's a mythic story doesn't mean that it didn't also happen. We live out our myths. Some of us perfect the myth. But the reason why those stories are so powerful for us is not a historical event. It's because that historical event represents this deep ancestral memory, this powerful story that's so near and dear to us. So people are acting out these stories in different ways, and the people who act them out very beautifully become a focus of our attention. So anything in astrology, the stories we have of the zodiac signs, once an astrologer or student of astrology holds on to an image in astrology of what a planet means, what Chiron means, what Ceres means, even the basic planets, or what Aries means, what Taurus means, and they feel the power of that archetype. You know, like that Taurus is this earthy, sensual, you know, we can understand the imagery, we can understand the story, it represents something vital. It can be very difficult for the astrologer to let go of it no matter how much evidence is presented against it. So one thing that I think is that the archetypes, these mythic stories, are fundamental. They are powerful. They're important to be aware of. As I said in the title for this video, the good, the bad, the ugly. The bad and the ugly part is how the power of the archetype leads us and sometimes inclines us to not be willing to let go of our assumptions of how that myth must get expressed. That certain kinds of people do not have to be the exclusive, perfect channels for some myth, and some zodiac sign or planet or house or rulership or anything else in astrology. We want that myth, it's powerful, but let's not be so certain that this paradigm, that this image, that this way that we've connected these powerful stories to the sky is correct. I think that the power of myth leads us astray because we insist on that myth being lived out in a particular way, and that it must be true. The myth is true. The archetype, the story, the narrative is true. It's an essential, fundamental, ancestral memory that is powerful and has purpose and meaning in our lives, needs to be sustained and improved and evolved. That's one of the reasons why we're alive. But it also needs to be done intelligently and not projecting and insisting that we know exactly who is going to play what part and what part of the cosmos must represent the image that we have. It's a pervasive problem in astrology. So in the vibrational astrology that I follow, that I utilize, it's very evidence-based. And we have questioned, we have shown very strong evidence that the zodiac signs do not operate exactly as often portrayed, that these mythic stories and images that are connected to the zodiac signs are not always true. There is some element of truth to it. We've done videos on extreme case sampling of Ceres, of Chiron, of other minor planets and so on, and the actual data shows that we need to adjust some of our beliefs about how the archetypal stories are connected to the cosmos. Okay, so I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. So that is the good, the bad, and ugly about archetypes in astrology. They are very powerful. Jung is correct. And we need to be observant and careful and question. Never stop questioning and continue to improve our models to see exactly how the archetypal stories and the mythology is connected to the cosmos. Thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.